Today's video is going to be an in-depth tutorial on how I create this look on the tops of my furniture pieces. This piece of furniture is just going to be an example. I did have to prime the piece because it was a laminate top, so I used an adhesive primer. It depends on what piece of furniture you're painting on, whether or not you need a primer, but I always recommend one. If it's really shiny, use an adhesive primer. If it has some stains or odors, or you think that it might have tannins, then use a blocking primer. So the first step, I take my darker color, and in this case, it's going to be Hurricane Gray. I've used black before, I've used dark browns, chocolates, whatever you're going to use. I always like to lay my darker color down first. Now, I usually use Dixie Belle's chalk mineral paint for this because it's water-based, it's really easy to use. I like the way that it comes off. I like the consistency. Every paint is going to vary. Every paint is going to be different. And every color you use, you're going to get a different effect. So for me, my go-to is always the Dixie Belle chalk mineral paint. So the first thing you notice, I used my water mister and I laid down quite a bit of water. I want this to be I'm going to lay down a really thin layer of paint, and it doesn't have to be perfect, especially because we're going to do the wash over it. So I'm not being really specific or really careful about brush strokes and all that, because this top, while it doesn't have a texture, it does look textured. With the chalk mineral paint, I can get a pretty flat coat on there. I can get it to be like almost brush stroke free. But it looks textured, which is very cool. And I usually do this technique on pieces where I just don't really know what to do with the top. And if I can't stain it, if it's not wood, this is a really good option. So I need to add 2 coats of the Hurricane Gray on the top, and I wait about 2 hours between drying times. And again, you can see how much water I'm actually spraying on the piece to get that smooth brushstroke free finish. You can see, because this is the first coat, that there are no brush strokes. You could just see the brush strokes, but there's no texture. It's really flat and smooth. But to get that full coverage and for that to go away, we're gonna add the second coat right now. And it's gonna be the same, just really thin. And as it covers those, and I use my water, those brush strokes, they just disappear. Whenever I paint the body of a piece in the blues, I love to use the gray base for this technique on the top, because once you add a white over the gray base, it almost has like this tint of blue. It's not blue, but it looks a little blue. So it just goes, it matches so nice. And if you have a warmer bottom, say you paint something red, or you paint something in a brown, or pink or whatever, you could always use a brown color as your base and then do a whitewash on top. Or you could I did a piece in green, so I made a black base and then I used a dark brown as my wash, and it absolutely beautiful. So once this dries, I only waited about a half an hour to an hour. I then start to apply my wash. And for the wash, I'm using Dixie Belle's chalk mineral paint in the color Fluff. This has a cool undertone to it, so it's not a transparent white and it's not a warm white, it's a cooler white. I love this because I have a blue bottom on this piece of furniture. So mixing the blue with the cool top, it's just gonna look really cohesive. You can do whatever you want, but I like to keep the cools with the cools and the warms with the warms. So for my first coat of wash, I added 4 tablespoons of the Fluff, and then I just added a little bit of water. I covered it until the water was about 1/4 of an inch over the paint. The consistency is pretty watery. I would say it's like milk. Only because there's paint in there, but it is very, very watery. And I like to do this because you could always add more coats, but you can't take them off. So you don't want it to be too thick. Now, my favorite rag to use is a lint-free microfiber cloth. whatever rag you use, it matters. If you're using a paper towel, it's going to be really dry. You're going to get a totally different look. If you're using a regular rag with a lot of texture, you're going to get a lot of texture. So I love the texture of the microfiber cloth. And because it's lint free, it doesn't leave a bunch of fuzzies or anything on your piece. So I fold it and make sure that I have that nice, there's no like edging on there, that it's nice and soft, because we want this to look nice and soft. I load up my brush and I'm gonna work in sections. And make sure you don't get any drips. If you drip, wipe them back and forth, because they'll sit there and they'll dry as like bubbles, little circles. And we don't want that. We want this to be back and forth like lines. I just go one section at a time, because if you do a lot all at once, your paint starts to dry and then you have a harder time removing it. And I like the way that it looks. I have a 2-inch brush here, so I like the 2 inches of paint. And then there's this line in between. So you can see how much I'm taking off. I do end up refolding my rag a couple of times because if you have too much on your rag, you're putting it back down and you're not wiping it up. Working one row at a time just allows me to take my time to make sure my line is nice and straight. If you start curving your hand, then you're going to have curves, and it just doesn't, when you have the curved top, it still looks good, but it looks really great, in my opinion, when you have really straight lines. So here's my second line. You can see again how much I'm taking off, but there's this little line in between the rows that stays there. And I like that. It's almost a little bit darker, so there's like light spots and dark spots. It gives the perception of depth and dimension. You could also use your fingers for this to press down and put a little pressure down, and you'll actually be able to see the marks on the wash from your fingers, but that also gives it a little bit more of dimension. I don't do that very often in the piece, only if it's starting to look like there's no lines or marks. Like if I'm too uniform, then I start to use maybe those 3 fingers. But normally you don't have to. The microfiber cloth, the way that it has the little marks on it, leaves those marks on the piece. So it ends up, if you just do it gently, it looks really good. See, like right there, I think I used 2 fingers because I wanted a little bit more dimension. I just put a little bit pressure down on my fingers. Then I just continue this down the piece until it's totally covered. And there's another thing I want you to keep in mind. When you're wiping back, don't keep wiping back in the same direction. You'll get those little marks that I was just pointing to. Like if you start wiping back from the left side every single time, you're gonna have one side that has all those marks. So switch from the left side to the right side, to the right side, to the left side with each row, so that you don't get so many marks. Or you could do, you start wiping back from the right side maybe for 2 rows, and then change it up for the next 2 rows, wiping back from the left side, starting at the left side. So this is only the first coat. I'm gonna add a total of 3 coats. We don't want it to be gray. We want it to be mostly white. So I am gonna add those other 2 coats. And for me, the perfect recipe is 3 thin coats of wash over the gray. That's for the blue bottom. I usually use my 2-inch brush. You could even switch up the size of the brush to get the lines to go in all different places, but I do like it looking a little bit uniform, and just using the lint-free cloth with the 2-inch brush and doing it 3 times, it's like the perfect recipe for me. Now for the front lip, I'm not doing full coverage. I'm just sort of dry brushing over it and then wiping it back. But if you add too much on your first coat, or if you add too much to the lip, then there's going to be no dimension, and it kind of throws the whole thing off because the lip is the first thing you're going to see. So you want to be careful, and you want to leave some of that gray on the lip. So I actually do wait a full hour and a half to 2 hours before adding my second coat. You want to make sure your first coat is really dry because you don't want to remove any more of it. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, so you're just doing this same thing over again and you're not even changing your brushes or anything? Yes. I don't know why, but it turns out so beautifully. Maybe because I'm putting the different pressure or I'm using my fingers in some spots, but you don't need to change out the size of your brushes for those lines. You're still going to get them even if they're in the same spots as it was on your first coat. We're just going to cover that gray more. And I'm telling you, it's so pretty. So right here, you can actually see that I'm starting to curve my line. If I could go back and make that line straight, I would. But a little curve is not going to be a horrible thing. But if you could get it straight, it's going to look even better. So just keep that in mind. And then I do add my third coat. I just think that third one pulls it all together. There's still too much of the gray showing through. For this one, I washed my brush out, so you don't want to leave your brushes to get dry or else there will be chunks of the paint on your brush. So I'm using my 2-inch, or maybe it's a 1.5-inch chip brush. But you could use whatever you want. Use the 2-inch brush, change it up, whatever you think. There's no specific rules for this. And this top is especially great if you have a top that has texture or kind of was destroyed. This is a perfect way to cover that. Because like I said, it doesn't have texture, but it has the illusion of texture. So anything underneath is just going to disappear because there's so much going on. And since it's my third and final coat, I'm just touching up that front lip one more time, just making sure that it looks good. It's not fully covered, but you just want to make sure that lip looks good because it is the first thing the eye sees. And to address the sides, as you're working on the piece, if you're getting drips, make sure that you're wiping them off. And you don't want to wipe them downward. You want to wipe them back and forth. So I didn't really have any drips on this side. So by the last coat, I'm just going to add a little bit of the wash and wipe it back. You don't have to go crazy with the sides. Now, you definitely want to add a clear coat to your top. You could add 2 or 3 coats. And this is like the best part. The clear coat makes all the difference. It's going to kind of tone down the fluff so that it's not, so in your face white. And it tones it down just slightly, just a tiny bit, but just enough. And I use the satin so that it looks silky and smooth. Another thing that I absolutely love about this top, if you're somebody who has trouble with streaks from the clear coat, it's so forgiving. Even if you get streaks, you can't really tell because we made that illusion of texture. So you really, really can't tell. It's really forgiving. You don't have to be as careful when you're creating this top. And if I miss any areas, I just go back on my second and third coat and cover them. But, if you look from the side, you can pretty much see where, you missed or didn't miss. You just follow the sheen. And I always do the top first, and then I go back to the front lip and then the sides last, just to make sure there's no drips. And just so you can see, I'm going to speed it up here, but I definitely add 2 more coats. For a top, you just want to make sure you have 2 or 3 coats. If you have something like gator hide or a triple thick, which is extremely hard to work with, but does do really good coverage. Or Country Chic has something called Tough Coat, which I love. You could use that for the top. The tops of your pieces are high traffic areas, so you want to make sure that you have protection on them. And here it is. That's the top of this piece. I absolutely love it, especially with the blue. If you want to see the full furniture makeover for this piece, click on this video right here.